Good afternoon, everybody. What a horrible day today. It's cold and miserable, and it's the first day of July. It seems absurd, doesn't it? We should be thinking about summer fairs and barbecues and house masses and all of that. And of course, it's gone, and now we discover that much of Leicester has been locked down. So it doesn't cheer you up too much, does it? Before I start on what I want to say today, there are two things I need to speak to you about. First of all, I'd like you to remember in your prayers today the family of a little child called Beatrix, who lived in her mum for 17 weeks and was born dead last week. And in the next hour, I am going to celebrate her burial with her mum and dad and grandparents and aunts and uncles and those of you who have been through this experience will know in particular just how painful it is. So please pray for Beatrix and for her parents in particular today. And the second thing is rather difficult, but I want to say it to you so that you all know at the same time. At the weekend I put a note in the newsletter saying that Father Isaac had left us and in fact he's now back in Ghana. And I don't want to not say to you why that is, because you'll only be thinking about it and asking about it, and people come to all sorts of conclusions, don't they? And the bottom line is Father Isaac has a serious psychiatric condition which he does not recognise himself. When he first arrived, it appeared to me there were certain things that didn't add up, didn't make sense, and I brushed them under the carpet, thought, well, he's come to a different country, there's the culture, there's all of those things to contend with. And I must say that all of you have been exceedingly kind to him, or tried to be, and welcoming, and I thank you most sincerely for that. But as time went on, it was obvious that there was something quite seriously wrong. Father disengaged himself from people. He seemed to have no empathy for those who were suffering, no sense of compassion, and that was unusual in a priest, really. Utterly, he withdrew completely from any sort of life that involved other people, and of course during this lockdown he even withdrew from me, and we live in the same house. And so I could see there were some very, very serious matters that were not cultural, but actually needed to be addressed. And I said it to him one evening quite some weeks ago, and he wasn't very happy about it, because most of the time he seemed very content in his own little bubble, saying a private mass every day, spending the rest of the time in his sitting room or his bedroom, and cooking the same meal, very same meal, twice a day for himself, and singing away to himself. He seemed quite happy, but it was a little bizarre. And then it transpired that he had written to his bishop and asked if he could come home. And our Bishop Patrick very kindly came to see him a week last Thursday, and he could get nothing out of Father Isaac said very little to him except that he'd made up his mind to go home. And it was actually quite rude to Bishop Patrick, which was not one bit justified. And I had already been to see Bishop Patrick myself about 6 weeks ago at the instigation of Father Brian, and spoken to him about this, and he was of a mind at that point to ask Father Isaac to go somewhere else, and if that didn't work out, maybe suggested he might need to go home. In the meantime, Father Isaac took that decision himself, and a week last Saturday he simply walked out of the door without warning. We did manage to locate him eventually, and after a fairly bizarre week staying in the company of Father Emmanuel in Our Ladies in Leicester, he finally got a plane and went home. This is a very sad situation. I have tried my level best to welcome this man, to include him, and to do things but he was either unable or unwilling to be part of that. And many of you rang up to speak to him, and he wouldn't talk to you and so on. So it's been a very sad episode, and I do thank you for trying to welcome him, but I now see that his problems were such that whatever anyone tried wouldn't make any difference, and he became quite impenetrable and withdrawn. I'd like to say a special word of thanks to Father Brian, my dear, dear friend. He's always been my rock and my mentor, but through this period he has seen much of this for himself. He's been incredibly supportive and reassuring, and also to Bishop Patrick, who's been very kind when he realised that obviously having Father Isaac here was a mistake, basically. So I hope and pray that Father will now be able to have some sort of assessment and some sort of treatment, if that's possible, when he's at home in Ghana, and that he would be able to settle himself into his life as a priest, among his people wherever they are, responding to their needs, sharing in their sorrows and joys, and leading them in the way of the Lord. So now you know the truth. It has been a very difficult and painful time, but I hope and pray that Father himself will find the peace that he needs, even though he may not recognise that he needs it, and that he'll be able to function again, and those of us who have found this difficult will be able to recover. And thank you for your thoughts and prayers on the matter. So we've been thinking about prayer, we talked about that, and what happens when we become finally people of prayer who are united to God. Does that affect our life? And it completely transforms our Christian discipleship, that we're not simply doing things for the sake of doing them or thinking it's a nice idea or even doing good deeds, but what we're actually doing is the Lord is doing it through us. The person who prays is the person through whom the Lord does things. So it's entirely different from what we may have thought before. And last time we talked about thinking with the mind of Christ and seeing with the eyes of Christ. How does the Lord see these things? How does he think about them? And is he thinking and seeing through me? Today we talk about speaking and serving with the lips, the voice, and the hands of Christ. I've probably told you this amusing story before. It's quite true, about a parish priest in Dublin. And there was some sort of pastoral problem in the parish, and one of the local bishops got involved, and people were complaining and doing all sorts. And this bishop kept ringing him up saying, "Now, Father, have you done something about this?" He said, "Well, yes, I think I'll be doing something." "Well, would you mind getting on?" And, he got quite fractious. And eventually, after about 6 months, this bishop rang up and he said, "Now, Father, have you done something about this or not?" And he said, "Well, my lord," he said, I think I have done something." "Oh," said the bishop, "and what, pray, have you managed to do to resolve this situation?" So the priest said to him, "Well, I sat myself down and I thought to myself, now what would Jesus do?" To which the bishop replied, "God, you didn't do that, did you?" So obviously they don't think the same way as the rest of us, do they? These days we speak rather too readily. People protest, shout, demand, and sometimes they can be very unpleasant and very unforgiving. And really, there is no place for that in Christ's church. There are things that sometimes we feel cross about or angry about, but we need to ask ourselves, maybe it's me. Maybe it's me not thinking with the mind of Christ. Maybe the Lord's not thinking through me, and too much of it is me. Last October we did a wonderful play called Without Words, and it was based on the expression of Pope Francis: preach the gospel and, if necessary, use words. And sometimes the words are what we speak through our actions, which of course we'll speak about in a moment, about serving with the hands of Christ. The two things are linked, that you speak sometimes through your actions, and that is what the Lord does to use us as his instruments. So the person who prays is the person who allows the Lord to speak through him. And what does he speak? What are the words of Christ? Well, the words of Christ are varied. The words, of course, of deep compassion and understanding, particularly for people who are vulnerable or outcast or little children. There's that sequence in the beginning of St. Luke's Gospel after the birth of the Lord, when he's baptized and he begins his ministry, and he stands up in the synagogue and everybody is overjoyed by what he said about the text of Isaiah being fulfilled. And then our Lord goes on to say, he talks about God choosing people who were not actually Jewish, a widow at Zarephath, a Syrian called Naaman, the leper, at which point they all got enraged and threw him out the synagogue. So sometimes the effects of the words of Christ are devastating for people, challenging, judgmental, and we see that a lot in the gospel. That doesn't mean that we should be judgmental, but we do need to speak with understanding and to speak little, if possible. When you put on the television and people are talking and they try to talk over each other, particularly during this virus, and the interviewer is talking to people and not really listening to what the person's saying. And any politician who says the magic sentence, "let me just say this," I can tell you what that means. He doesn't want to answer the question. He wants to answer something else. He wants to distract the interviewer from asking a painful question, which they're perfectly justified to do. But at the same time, they need to listen to the answer. And if they don't agree with it, say so, but not cut the person off. There's a lot of that going on now, isn't there? And above all else, Jesus speaks the truth. And the person who thinks like with Christ, who sees like Christ, will know the truth. Because Jesus himself is the way, the truth, and the life. And to speak the truth to the present situation is often very challenging indeed. These days, we find it difficult to understand what truth is. Sometimes people say, well, that's your opinion, that's your truth, this is my truth. And of course, in the last 4 years, which coincide with the presidency of a certain gentleman in the United States, new expressions have entered our vocabulary. Fake news or alternative facts. And these fake things, these alternative facts, are being presented to us as the truth when they are nothing like the truth at all. But because they are presented to us so vehemently, and so how many people can accept them because they don't think about it, they then mistake them for the truth. There are lots of truths about many things, like the dealing with the coronavirus, the economy, world interaction between nations and races, of course, climate change. And if we don't want to hear it, we can shut our minds to it. But we're still called to speak it. even if it means we might lose friends. I have, as you know, a great devotion to Blessed Jerzy Popiełuszko, who was a priest like me, who during the days of Solidarność in Poland in the early 1980s spoke the truth when no one was allowed to do so. He spoke the truth that came from Christ. It wasn't his own truth, it wasn't his own opinion about people who'd been unjustly imprisoned, people who had been abused and tortured, even murdered. And for that, he was murdered himself, for speaking the truth. It is a very salutary thing. Many of the modern martyrs, like Blessed Jerzy, have suffered for the same thing. We think of Oscar Romero. We think of many, many other people, Dr. Martin Luther King, the Mary Knowles sisters, the Tiberine monks, many, many others who, speaking the truth that comes from Christ, lost their lives because people could not bear to hear it. So to speak with the words of Christ is to allow Christ to speak in me. And that can only happen when we have a life with him in our prayer. It can only happen. If our prayer is just about me and all about what I need and want, that is not the true life of union with Christ. And our activities, our words, can become too easily our own opinion or for our own self-aggrandizement. It all comes from the prayer. And likewise, to serve with the hands of Christ. We are called to serve the Lord in many ways. Myself in the priesthood, many of you through your married life, as parents, husbands and wives, and some people through the single life. We're called to serve in the places of work where we are, among our friends, among those in need, and of course within the Christian community. But again, that comes from the life with our Lord in prayer, so that these acts of service, if you like, become instinctive. And when a need arises, we don't say no, we always say, how? How can I do this? I remember many years ago I had a wonderful friend called David. He was a Cockney, he was a real character, the most fantastic man. And when he was dying from cancer in Guildford in hospital there, I went to see him. And there he was in quite a state. And he heard that a friend of his was in the next ward. And Dave said, "We must go and see him." He was this man who was so seriously ill, who felt this compunction, desire to go and see his friend. I must go and see him. That must, if you like, was something that came from within. It was not imposed from outside. And so our service of the Lord is what comes from within. And we do it without question. I find that most graphically illustrated for me when I am working in the baths in Lewin. I've told you many times how important this is, because we're all there doing the same work together. Nobody's more important than anybody else. And that togetherness that comes from the service, la service as we call it, il servizio, is most amazing. It binds you together. It gives you such a sense of purpose and joy, because we are all serving together. And that's my vision for the church, particularly in our three parishes, that we can evolve a situation where we serve together instinctively because of our life with the Lord in our prayer. We get that bit right, and all the rest of it follows. All the rest of it follows. So it's a big challenge for us to allow God to be God in our lives, to allow him to think through us, see through us, speak through us, and serve through us. But once that happens, I promise you, there is the greatest delight. And in these last few weeks, we have discovered, many people have discovered what I mean by that when they volunteered to push newsletters through people's letterboxes, or do a little bit of shopping for someone, or ring someone up, someone that they never knew previously. And they come back to me and they say, "Oh, this is marvellous, we love this," as if they never noticed it before. But allowing the Lord to do things through you, to bring his light and joy and compassion to others, is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing. And as I say, many people have now come to see that for themselves. It's always my hope and prayer that as we move forward in our communities, no longer with any priests, that we can all perceive this and create together with the Lord's help a loving, praying, serving community to the glory of his name.